The voice of sharing, Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene, and you are listening to Durian ASEAN. And today, in Blast from the Grassroots, we have my consti. We have the representative. His name is Daniel Albert. Welcome to Durian ASEAN studio. How are you?
Hi, Arlene. I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Mm-hmm. And today you'll be speaking about the federal and state relations. Is that so?
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So, first of all, just to recap, tell us what is My Consti all about?
My Consti is an initiative by the Constitutional Law Committee under the Malaysian Bar that is, in essence, aimed at increasing awareness of the federal constitution amongst Malaysians. In essence, it is about empowering Malaysians to understand their rights that are enshrined under the federal constitution.
Mm-hmm. So what is the constitution? I mean, we had an earlier discussion with another representative from My Consti talking about institutional constitution and also the separation of state. But in terms of the constitution itself, what is it?
The constitution is the single most important document in our country. It is the supreme law of the land. It is the source of all powers. It is the source of all powers and laws in this country. So, it is in essence at the pinnacle of the law in our country. Now, breaking it down, giving an example of how it affects you and me as Malaysian citizens. We are Malaysian citizens because the federal constitution says so. We can vote every 5 years. We go to the ballot boxes and we vote for our elected representatives because the federal constitution gives us the right to do so. Our elected representatives, they sit in parliament and they have the right to make laws that are applicable to you and me. Why do they have the right to do that? It's because the federal constitution gives them the power to do so. In the same way, our Prime Minister, Datuk Sri Najib, he has the power. He and his government, the cabinet and the ministers in the cabinet and his government, they have the power to implement these laws. They have the power to do so because the federal constitution accords them these powers. So you will see that it regulates all facets of the relationship between us as citizens and the government, and all facets of the relationship between the government and the states. So it is an all-encompassing document. That's what the federal constitution is.
Mm-hmm. I see. And for My Consti, you run this campaign called the Rakyat Guides, where you have, I think, 9 Rakyat Guides, if I'm not mistaken, or 8.
9.
9.
Yeah. So what we've tried to do is this. Now, the federal constitution is essentially a document that is rather complicated. It is very legalistic. It is a document, I'll be honest, in saying that many lawyers, let alone lay people, find difficult understanding.
So in other words, it's dry and boring.
It's dry and boring. It's exceptionally dry and boring. I will be the first to admit it. So what we've tried to do is we've tried to take out the key concepts from the federal constitution, simplify them, and put them in very simple pocket-sized guides that would enable any layperson, any Malaysian to pick it up and be able to grasp the basic concepts of the federal constitution.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we're trying to do. We're just trying to simplify this very complicated document.
Oh, that's interesting. And I have one with me, which is on the federal and state relation, which happened to be the topic of our discussion today.
That's right, yes.
It's very colorful. I mean, it's a very nice looking pamphlet that I think anyone, if even a 10-year-old kid, if he or she wants to know more about the federal and state relations Rakyat Guide, I think it will be easy for the person to understand.
To be honest, that's what we tried to do. When we drafted it, what we had in mind is a very simple guide that could be digested by people across the age. Well, it does not matter how old or how young they are, across racial, across religious divide, across geographical divides. So we tried to put together something that was in essence very, very simple for anyone and everyone, for all Malaysians to understand. Because at the end of the day, all Malaysians should know their rights, regardless of your age, regardless of your race, regardless of your religious leanings or your political affiliation.
So, let's talk about the federal and state relations, which you'll be sharing a lot today. First of all, what is it?
Okay, now the federal-state relations, taking things a step back. To start with, we're all taught in schools that Malaysia is a federation. Now, what does this mean? What does a federation mean? A federation is an act whereby states or organizations come together under a single union or entity with centralized control. So, historically, when we gained independence, the states in Malaysia came together. The states who were all, to a certain extent, independent. We had the federated, we had non-federated states, and they all had their own respective state governments. They came together, and what they did was they acceded a certain amount of power to the federation, and at the same time they retained a certain amount of power in respect to themselves, and that's how the Malaysian Federation was first born. So, coming back to federal-state relations, the essence of it is this. Now, in Malaysia, we have 13 states and 3 federal territories. Now, all these states have accorded a certain amount of power to Parliament, to the Malaysian Parliament. And as a result, the Malaysian Parliament is able to make laws that is applicable across the entire country. And at the same time, there is a government, a federal government, that is elected by the entire country that has the power to implement these laws across the entire country. Now, this can be contrasted with the state governments and state parliaments. Now, as you're aware, every 5 years when you go to the ballot box, you vote for your state rep as well as for your parliament rep, your national rep. Now, this state rep, they all come together under what is known as a state legislative assembly or a state parliament. And they have the ability to make laws that are applicable only in respect of the state. And in the same way, there is a state government. For example, in Selangor, we have the state government that's being led by Tan Sri Khalid Ibrahim, the Selangor state government. And they have the power to implement laws made by the state parliament that is applicable solely in respect of Selangor. So this is how you have, this is what I mean by, this is what we mean when we talk about federal-state relations. There is this divide, there is this distinction between institutions and between powers.
I see. So it is a very long explanation about state and federal relations. How can Parliament and state make laws in the concurrent list? You have several lists, right?
Yeah.
And you have one of it is the concurrent list. And tell me more about the concurrent list first.
Okay. Now, just to take things back a little bit. Now, what there is in order to ensure that there is some order in this, there are different lists in the Federal Constitution. There is a Parliament list. There's a list which enables Parliament to make laws in respect of. And there is a state list, which the areas which the state can make laws in respect of. And there is this concurrent list, which we have mentioned, which is an area whereby both federal and state can make laws in respect of. Now, the concurrent list currently includes things like social welfare, scholarships, protection of wild animals, town and counter planning. Water is now on the concurrent list.
And water is a controversial issue in Selangor, especially.
It is because, actually, previously water was on the state list. And it was, historically, a matter within the purview of the state. However, if I'm not mistaken, 2002, there was a study done by the government in an effort to come up with a commission, a national water commission, or a body that would regulate how water services are provided in Malaysia. And then they realized we can't do that because it is in the state list. So what happened was, at that time, there was there was an amendment to the Federal Constitution. They had 2/3 majority support, and as a result, water was moved to the concurrent list. And flowing from that's how the legislation that relates to water that is in place today came about. Legislation that applies across Malaysia, privatizing water entities and requiring them to get a license from the federal government. So that it was previously a state matter, now it is a federal matter. But recent developments, what has most recently occurred in Selangor, is that I think the government has decided to take advantage of a provision under the current law that enables them to take full control of the Selangor Water Concessionaire Company. And I do believe what's happening is that they are in talks with the state government to allow the Selangor state to take back control of this. So that's what's currently happening now.
I see. So it is still under the state or under the federal?
Right
in
now,
principle,
principle, it is still under the state, and that's in accordance with the federal constitution. It was previously it is currently under the federal government. What they are trying to do now, what Tan Sri Khalid and his government, state government, trying to do now, is they are trying to buy over control of that.
I see.
That's right.
It is possible, is it?
It is possible, provided the federal government agrees to it. The mechanics is, very briefly, that there is a provision under current act relating to water services, which enables the federal government to take full control of the water concessionaire company. And thereafter, I do believe there will be some agreement that would be reached that would enable the Selangor state government to then take over control from the federal government. I do believe that's how they're going about it.
I see.
Yeah.
So the concurrent list is pretty complicated.
It is complicated in the sense that you can have both federal government and state government making laws in respect of the same area. Now, so long as the laws do not overlap, they can coexist. That's fine. When there is an overlap, that is where the problem happens. And in an instance like that, what happens is you then have to go to the courts to determine whether the the area is properly in respect of a concurrent matter, and if so, who has jurisdiction over it. Now, under the federal constitution, whenever things overlap, the federation has the power to implement laws. So the federation's laws take priority. However, this is provided that it falls wholly within the concurrent list. There have been instances where Parliament enacts laws which they believe fall under the concurrent list, but when challenged in courts, it is then determined, no, it's actually a state matter, and therefore you cannot do such a thing, and the laws are struck down. So that has happened in the past.
What about on scholarship and welfare? How much of it is under federal and how much of it is under state? Or is it entirely under state's jurisdiction?
Scholarships and welfare are both part of the concurrent list. So both federal, there are federal grants that are available for scholarships. There are state grants as well for welfare and scholarships. So as long as
they coexist,
right? It's completely separate. And as long as they don't overlap, as long as they don't contradict each other, they can continue to coexist.
What about the list that is not the concurrent list, meaning that the list that is exclusively state and exclusively for federal?
That's right. So generally, the matters in relation to the federal list are larger issues affecting the country. For example, our external affairs, our defense, energy, the legal system, citizenship, larger macro matters. State powers are largely limited to matters concerning, for example, Islamic law and custom, land, agriculture, forest, minerals. This is all under the state list. Yeah.
Talking about minerals,
Yeah.
what about our oil and gas?
Okay, now, oil and gas is a tricky issue. Strictly speaking, under the federal constitution, minerals all come under the state. However, what has happened is in respect of petroleum products, now there was a law that was passed called the Petroleum Development Act. This was when Petronas was first founded. And what the law does is it vests ownership of all petrol that is obtained from the country with Petronas. So it takes it out of state possession and it vests ownership with Petronas. And under the Act, what happens is Petronas is then supposed to share the revenue that it obtains from it with the state government and with the federal government in accordance with agreements that are reached.
But is it happening?
Well, that is it is to a certain extent, and it is not to a certain extent.
Because
Now,
majority of, the poorest countries, the poorest states in Malaysia are actually states with petroleum and gas.
Correct. So I think what you're talking about is the Terengganu issue, right? That is what was
Terengganu, Kelantan, and also Sabah Sarawak to some
Sarawak, yeah.
extent.
So what happened was, for example, let's take Terengganu, because Terengganu was the state that took it to court. What happened in Terengganu is that for the longest time, there was a division of revenue that was given to the state, to the Terengganu state. I believe something like 5% was paid by Petronas yearly for the products, the petroleum products that were obtained from state. However, and this proceeded from 78 when the Act first came about, 74, until about 2000. But it stopped in Terengganu in 2000. And it stopped when the state government had fallen to the opposition. Now, the reason for that, the reason that was published in the media was, I think our then Prime Minister said that the state government then was not capable of properly managing such large funds. That was what was published in the media. But what the state government then did was they took it to court. They challenged this. And it actually turned on a legal issue because the petrol that was obtained from Terengganu was actually obtained off the coast of Terengganu. And the question was whether petrol that was obtained outside 3 nautical miles from the border of Terengganu, from the coast of Terengganu, whether Terengganu was still entitled to it. So that was the question of law that went before the courts. However, with the fall of the state government recently, that case, as the state government is now back in the control of Barisan Nasional, the case was actually withdrawn from the court, so it was never determined. And I do believe the federal government has started paying the state government again. So that's how it's panned out.
I see.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they are being paid in a
Now.
way. Only now.
Terengganu, now, to the best of my knowledge, they are being paid. Correct. Yeah.
So they deserve the oil royalty, as in, it is considered as a shared resource.
Correct. You see, historically what happened was minerals were always supposed to be within the state, right? Thereafter, there was this act that came about that vested petrol in particular with Petronas. But it was on the understanding that there would be an equitable distribution of revenue because the states rely a lot on this kind of funding. The issue of funding is central to a state being able to run efficiently and independently, because without proper funding, you just cannot function. So the states are very reliant on these things. And yes, the failure to give the states this kind of revenue does have a tremendous impact on the kind of development the states see.
What is the source of funding for states?
For states, I will be honest in saying all the main funding goes to the federal government. When I say main funding, it is things like your taxes, your income taxes go to the federal government. Your corporate tax, your import and export duty, service tax, sales tax, they all go to the federal government. State tax is things like revenue from your local council, rent from state properties, receipt from sale of lands. These are things that the state gets. Now, because this is not enough, alongside that, what happens is the state gets what is called a capitation grant. A capitation grant is a certain amount that the government pays on a yearly basis based on the population of the state. So I think if you look at our Rakyat guides, we've set out the figures there for the capitation grant. It is, I think the figures are, give me a second. It's
72 ringgit for each person.
That's right. For the first
100,000
that's
people.
right. And then 10 ringgit and 20 cents each for the next 500,000
That's a lot of
people.
difference.
Yeah, exactly. So there is this capitation grant. There is also what is known as a state road grant, which is for maintenance of the state roads. State road grant, yeah. And then there are other types of funds, for example, contingency funds, state reserve funds, that are funds that the federal government allocate to the state government. But this is an issue, I think, that a lot of states, particularly in the opposition in Malaysia, are facing, because they do not have, I think with the richer states it's not so much of a problem, but with the poorer states, they do not have, they feel that they do not have access to sufficient funding to actually develop the state. You see, if you go back, the manner in which the federal constitution was drafted was to allocate as much power and as much resources to the federation. And the purpose of that was to strengthen the federation as a whole. But I think the purpose, at the same time, there was always a belief that the states would be allocated sufficient money from the federation to ensure for proper development and management.
So I would guess that the federal have more power when it comes to the state and federal relations.
Certainly. A lot. The bulk of power is centralized with the federation.
If you would give like 1 to 10,
Yes.
how much? What is the value of the state power, and what is the value of a federal power?
I think if you look at powers and rights that are accorded under the federal constitution, and this is my own personal view, I would say your division is something like, I think 80% of your power is contained in the federal constitution. As when it comes to the division between federal and state, 80% of that is centralized with the federal government, with a small remaining portion with the states.
Another thing that is interesting is you mentioned that the issue of land is under the state's jurisdiction, but a lot of the times when people complain, their land were being grabbed, or they face some problems with their land, being taken away by the government, they always say that, it's the federal government's fault. But is it true? Or
well, actually, yes and no, in the sense that the federal government, there are mechanisms which enable the federal government to acquire land. They do have to go through the state government, but at the end of the day, it's a federal government initiative. But there can also be state government initiatives which require acquisition of land. So it can be the federal government, it can be state. It really does depend on case to case.
So what if the government wants to build just let's say a highway that cut across all states, or the MRT, and they have to cut across certain lands, and those lands might be private property or might be belonging to state government. How do state and federal, resolve this kind of issue?
So what happens is there are laws that are in place which enable our federal government to acquire lands for purposes of projects such as this, and there are certain procedures, there are certain checks that are set, or safeguards that are set in place to ensure that when such land is acquired, whether it's from the state government or whether it's from individual ownership, there is compensation that is paid based to a certain extent on current market value. That there are laws in place to enable them to do that.
I see. So what is that you can share about the power within the federal government that is probably they have taken away the rights of the state government?
Well, now, if you look at the list, right, you have your federal list and your state list. However, there are certain exceptions which allow the government, the federal government, to legislate in respect of the state list. An example is when there's a proclamation of emergency, which has happened before. Just prior, before and after independence, there was the communist insurgency, and there was a proclamation of emergency in respect of them. Now, in an instance like this, the government can legislate in respect of the state list. That's one example. Another example is, for example, the TPPA. That is an example. The TPPA is an example of an international, I think it's a free trade agreement between a number of countries. Now, under the federal constitution, the federation, the federal government, parliament, has the power to make laws to enforce international agreements that have been reached that Malaysia has agreed to, international conventions that Malaysia has signed up to or ratified. So there is that mechanism under the federal constitution which allows the federal government to enable to put into place agreements they've reached internationally to enable them to implement their obligations locally. Yeah.
Talking about the TPPA,
Yep.
which is a form of foreign policy for this country, I'm just wondering, do state have any rights or any power towards giving a say on how our foreign policy would, go?
Foreign policy is a matter that comes within the federal government. Now, the TPPA is actually at the heart of it. The TPPA is a free trade agreement, but it's an all-encompassing free trade agreement that encompasses many facets of government. I do believe that currently, I think the body that is in charge is MITI. I do believe they are consulting various federal institutions as well as state institutions in coming up with the terms that Malaysia is agreeable to. But to what extent the consultation is effective, I don't know, because I also do believe that a lot of it is protected by secrecy clauses in the TPPA. In terms of going back to your question, what rights do they have to stop it? That is a difficult question to answer because it really depends on what they're trying to legislate. If it's in respect of a federal matter, then they are perfectly entitled to do so. If in respect of a state matter, it depends what kind of state matter and whether there are safeguards in the federal constitution from stopping it. But like I said, there is that provision that enables the federal government to implement international agreements like this, and despite the fact that it contradicts state law.
So can Parliament make laws on matters related to the state list?
Yes. Going back to what I was saying earlier, that is in instances where, for example, there's a proclamation of emergency or where there is international agreement, then they can. Generally, they should not and ought not to. Generally, the states should be allowed to independently go about the areas of governance which they're entitled, which they are accorded.
What about the other way around, which is can the state assembly person make laws for Parliament?
Generally, no, unless Parliament gives them the right to do so.
Is there any example of
where Parliament has given state, not that I can think of off the top of my head, but generally,
no? Yeah. So we have talked about how these laws are made, but who carries out this law? Is it the duty of the state or the federal government?
The laws that are made by the federal government are implemented by the laws that are made by Parliament, the Malaysian Parliament, are implemented by the federal government. In the same way, the laws that are made by the state legislative assembly or state parliament is implemented by the state government. That's how the division of implementation works.
So if you say like that, what about local government election? Can a state call for it, or do they need the consent or the decision making by the federal government?
Strictly speaking, local government councils come within the purview of the states. And in the past, I do believe there have been attempts to do so. But I do also believe that there's certain legislation in respect of this that has been enacted that they are trying to address now. So it is a grey area to the best of my knowledge. Yeah.
So anything to add on that I've missed on the federal and state relations?
No, I think we've pretty much covered it. It is the concepts are simply that there is this division, and it is important for Malaysians to understand this division, because by you understanding which area of governance is governed, by understanding who is in charge of which area of governance, you are able to ascertain who should be accountable for that particular area of governance. For example, water. Who should you be blaming if something goes wrong? If the roads in your area are not properly maintained, who is in charge? If
there's potholes in your
correct.
taman.
So this is the significance of the federal state relations, so that you are able to ascertain who to hold accountable. So
it's important for us Malaysians to know, not just our rights, but what is the duty of the federal and the state,
sure,
and
definitely.
their relations, and who is accountable for what. So at the end, we know who should be accountable for our needs as the rakyat. Anyway, thank you very much.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for coming to Durian ASEAN. Yeah, we hope that we will have another one more, the next session on My Consti as well, right?
That's right.
Which will be another 2 weeks' time. What would be the title?
The next session would be on Parliament. So today we talked about Parliament, but very briefly we talked about in relation to the distinction between the Malaysian Parliament, the Federal Parliament, and the State Parliament or State Legislative Assembly. The next session, we would go more in depth into Parliament, the Malaysian Parliament, how it functions, what is its composition, who are the people appointed to Parliament, what are their roles there.
So stay tuned.